In a small hospital in a little town, the day was filled with unrest. A worried woman stood in the corridor while doctors operated on her brother inside. The man had sustained a serious injury at work, suffering a bone fracture that required surgical intervention. The surgery lasted about 3 hours, and when the doctor emerged from the operating room, he briskly worked past the woman without addressing her questions. She remained standing in the hallway, watching the direction in which the doctor had gone. A few minutes later, a nurse approached her and informed her that her brother was fine. Someone knocked gently on the door of the staff room. The surgeon, resting inside after the procedure, allowed the visitor to enter. He looked tired, for he truly was exhausted, but he could never deny a conversation, especially with a patient or relative of someone he had treated. "Greg, I wanted to thank you," the woman politely said to the doctor who had just operated on her brother. "No need," the surgeon replied. "The operation wasn't complicated. Everything went well." Still, the woman placed a package on the table, thanked the surgeon again, and left the office. Greg glanced indifferently at the gift before shoving it under the table. However, he decided to peek inside the bag and said, "As usual, everyone brings the same thing. Brandy and chocolates," Greg said with a somber tone. "Why bring these to doctors and then complain that nothing gets done in hospitals without bribes?" The man stored the package in a cupboard. Since he didn't drink alcohol, the gifted bottles of brandy were either gifted to his colleagues or just left in the staff room cupboard for some holiday or other significant occasion. Greg was a very kind and compassionate man, just currently preoccupied with family issues. Thus, he couldn't think about anything else, as his work provided a slight distraction from his troubles. Greg was going through a divorce. His wife, with whom he had been happily married for 5 years, had told him a week ago that she had fallen in love with another man. Chandra often traveled to a neighboring city for work, and it was there that she met a businessman. For a year, she had an affair with him, hidden from her husband, before deciding to leave Greg. What could her husband offer her? The modest salary of a regular surgeon and a small house in a little town. Greg and his wife lived in a small town, just a 10-minute drive from the city, but he refused to move there. The news of his wife leaving for another man hit him hard. He loved her, dreamed of having children, and hoped that someday he could persuade her to have a child with him. But Chandra always refused. Now, Greg was spending a lot more time at work. He took on extra shifts to keep his mind off the divorce. He wanted to immerse himself in his work, but the atmosphere of the small hospital only deepened his depression. He figured it was better than sitting at home alone, dwelling on memories of a happy life with Chandra. Every day felt the same to him. Home, work, patients who increasingly asked to be referred to the hospital in the big city, not trusting the expertise of local doctors. Even though Greg was an excellent specialist, people wanted their treatments at a modern facility. Among his colleagues, Greg only talked to Bob, a therapist. They had known each other for half their lives, having studied together at university. Bob, too, had divorced 2 years prior, and his wife also left him for the big city. "Maybe we're doing something wrong," Bob said. "Maybe we should also strive to grow, try something new. I'm sure you could find a job in any city. Why stay here? If we all leave, who will be here to treat and save the lives of the locals?" Greg replied, "Not everyone can afford to travel to other cities for surgery. In the small town where I live, there isn't even a hospital, and local elders come here for treatment. Even this short distance is hard for them to travel." "I see. You're sacrificing your future for the sake of others," Bob concluded. When Greg was heading home after a long shift at the hospital, he noticed a child sitting on a bench near his house. It was Niall, a boy who lived next door. Greg checked his watch and saw it was already 10 o'clock at night. Not the best time for an 8-year-old to be wandering around, Greg thought, asking, "Why are you out here so late?" Niall looked up, and Greg noticed tears streaming down the boy's cheeks and a small scrape on his chin. He immediately understood what had happened. Niall was raised by his mother alone, who could hardly be called exemplary. Sandra drank heavily, and many locals would come over to keep her company. Of course, no one looked after the child during these times. Concerned neighbors had reported the family to Child Protective Services. Sandra was given one last chance to change her behavior and her treatment of her son, or else Niall could be sent to an orphanage. For 3 months, she tried to turn her life around, got a job, and stopped drinking. But it seems that's where her efforts ended. Greg didn't ask the boy any questions. Instead, he simply invited Niall over so he wouldn't have to spend the night on the streets. He gave him some soup, and then went to talk to Sandra. The woman didn't come out to greet Greg, and when he entered the house, he found her asleep on the floor near the sofa, with 2 glasses and an empty alcohol bottle on the table. Greg decided not to wake her, opting instead for a serious talk the next day when she would be sober. "Did your mom hit you?" Greg asked the boy. "No, I fell by myself," Niall answered. Seeing Greg's skeptical look, he added, "I'm not lying. I really did fall by myself while running away from Jim." "Jim, who lives on your street?" Greg clarified. "Yes, my mom fell asleep, and I wanted to kick him out of our house. He swung at me, so I ran, and then I fell," the boy explained. Greg was furious, as he had a deep love for children and couldn't stand to see them mistreated. He had tried multiple times to reason with Sandra, but to no avail. Greg believed that in this case, the child would be better off in a shelter than with his own mother. He fed Niall and put him to bed, but found it hard to fall asleep himself. Greg couldn't stand the injustice children faced. Greg had a general love for people. That's why he always found it hard to ignore other people's tragedies and never remained indifferent to the suffering of others. It was this compassion that had drawn him to the medical profession. It was a compassion that both helped and hindered him in life. It stopped him from fighting for his wife, understanding that another man could provide for her better than he could. For a while, Greg even justified Sandra's alcohol dependency. After all, she began drinking after her husband died, leaving her completely alone with a young child. No one expected the woman's depression to turn into alcohol dependency. By the time the neighbors realized it, it was too late. The next morning, the man woke up earlier than usual, despite it being his day off from work. He got up early specifically to talk to Sandra before she had a chance to start drinking again. Niall was still asleep, which wasn't surprising since the boy had fallen asleep very late after experiencing a significant emotional upset the night before. Greg knocked loudly on the door, and Sandra opened it swiftly. Her eyes were anxious and angry, but when she saw Greg, her expression turned notably dismayed. She had clearly been expecting someone else. "Did you lose your son?" Greg asked, noticing the woman's agitated state. "If you don't know where he is, then don't waste my time," Sandra replied dismissively. She tried to close the door, but Greg stopped it with his hand. He immediately reproached Sandra for not resembling a mother who is searching for her missing son. "It's time to think about whether your boy is happy," the man said. "I found him outside my house yesterday, crying with a bruise on his face. You know I've always defended you against the other neighbor's criticism. But how have you used the chance given to you by Child Protective Services? Is Niall at your place now?" Sandra asked, as if she hadn't heard what the man had said. "For now, he is with me, but he could have ended up in a shelter if the police had found him, not me." With every word, Greg's tone became more intense. He was angry, and you could have found him in a ditch somewhere. Remember, at last, that you are a mother. So many people dream of becoming parents but can't, and yet you prioritize alcohol over your child. Sandra broke down in tears, genuinely regretting her behavior but admitting she couldn't give up alcohol. Greg began to talk to her, and each of his sentences made the woman reflect. He said he was ready to help her. He offered to take her to a clinic, find a specialist who could help her overcome her alcohol dependency. Otherwise, if she refused, Greg himself would take the boy to a shelter, and this motivated Sandra. She said she was ready to change. Greg entered Sandra's house and collected all the alcohol she had. The woman herself poured the contents of the bottles down the sink, saying she believed that this time she would succeed. After that, they went to Greg's house for Niall. The boy immediately ran into his mother's arms. It was painful to witness such sincere childlike love for such an irresponsible mother. Niall loved his mom very much. It didn't matter to him what her dependencies were. For him, she would always be the best mom. The man escorted his guests out, closed the door, and sighed. Now, he could finally enjoy his weekend, and the best relaxation for him was a change of activity. He needed to fix the gate and clean the house, but his plans for domestic chores were interrupted. As soon as Greg took out the tools to repair the gate, his phone rang. "Greg, you need to be at the hospital in half an hour for a surgery," said the hospital chief in an anxious voice. "Dermot, I was supposed to have today off," Greg replied reluctantly. "We have a very important patient. We need the best surgeon," Dermot pleaded. "A businessman from the capital has been brought in. He was in a serious accident. It's critical to perform the surgery as soon as possible, so please hurry." Dermot knew that Greg didn't need much persuading. He was a very responsible employee who always tried to help everyone. Greg did just that. He put the toolbox back, quickly changed into his work attire, and headed to his car. Greg would go to any patient. The social status of the person didn't concern him. As Greg drove out of the small town onto the highway, a small silhouette caught his attention. He noticed a child walking along the roadside. There was no doubt in his mind that it wasn't an adult. Despite being in a rush to the hospital, he couldn't ignore it. He couldn't leave a child on the road. Greg pulled over next to the girl, and seeing the car, she also stopped. Greg realized he had done the right thing not passing her by. Tears were streaming down her cheeks. "Are you lost? Where are your parents?" he asked gently. "No, I'm not lost. And I don't have any parents," the girl replied. Greg asked her name, and the girl introduced herself as Chyla. He inquired why she was crying and where she was coming from. The girl seemed hesitant to reply, as if she was afraid or perhaps unwilling to share, but she found herself trusting Greg, sensing somehow that he was a kind person. "I don't know where I'm heading," Chyla sobbed. "I always told them I'd run away. Tessa didn't believe me. She scolded me, but I did run away. None of them liked me there. Now, nobody will be able to hurt me." Greg suspected that the little girl might have escaped from a shelter. There was one for young children in the neighboring small town. He couldn't take her back because he understood it would take up a lot of his time. Therefore, Greg decided to take Chyla with him to work, planning to address her situation afterward. He offered to take her to the city with him, but she refused, saying she wouldn't go in a car with a stranger. "You're smart not to trust strangers," praised Greg, "but I promise I won't harm you. If you disagree, you can continue working alone on the road. I'm late for surgery and don't have time to persuade you." Greg returned to his car. Chyla watched him carefully and then ran after him to the vehicle. She climbed into the passenger seat and said, "You don't seem like a bad person. And even if you are, it doesn't matter to me. I'll probably die soon from hunger and the cold anyway." Greg drove off, but the girl's words shook him. He couldn't understand how such a young child could think in this manner. Chyla seemed no older than 8, yet she was convinced she would die soon, certain that nothing good awaited her in life. He thought about how dreadful conditions must be in shelters for Chyla to decide on such a desperate act as to run away from there. He didn't ask Chyla about how she ended up in the shelter, but she was curious about who her rescuer was. Greg was happy to share that he worked as a surgeon and, although he had no family, he dearly wished for a child. "There are many kids in the shelter who wish for a family. You could become a father without a wife," Chyla told him. "Little girl, you're too young to think about such things. But maybe I'll consider it." Greg replied. Chyla just couldn't stop asking questions. She turned out to be a very curious girl, eager to know everything. However, Greg was reluctant to share details about his own life. He didn't even want to recall the events he had recently gone through, so he decided to find out why Chyla had run away from the orphanage. Didn't they keep an eye on you? How did you manage to escape from the orphanage? He asked. It wasn't hard. The girl replied with a dismissive wave of her hand. By now, she seemed much more relaxed and was no longer afraid of Greg. They don't care about us at all. They took us out for a walk, and I just left. I had no friends, so nobody noticed I was gone. I think nobody will even realize I'm missing. Chyla's voice carried a sadness that deeply moved Greg. It revealed how much hurt and pain were hidden in her small frame. Was it really that bad there? He asked quietly. Yes, it was terrible. They could even hit us. Chyla recounted. And the older kids always took our toys. If we got candy for lunch, I never got to eat any because the boys would take them all. Remembering he had 2 chocolate bars in the car for snacks, Greg quickly fetched them and offered them to the girl. Chyla's face lit up with a smile. She looked at the slightly squished and partially melted chocolate bars as if they were the most precious treasure in the world. She carefully opened the wrapper, and when she bit into the bar, her smile widened. It was a clear indication of how tough life had been for her in the orphanage. Greg recalled thinking earlier that day how Niall might be better off in an orphanage. Clearly, he had been mistaken. No one deserved such a life. It would be better for a child to be with a not-so-great mother who could, from time to time, provide some love and care. Not wanting to leave the girl in the car, especially not knowing how long the surgery might take, Greg decided to bring her into the hospital. He knew no one would question him about the child. In their medical establishment, there were hardly any strict rules or order. Nurses often brought their own sick children or grandchildren when there was no one at home to care for them. Who did you bring this time? Bob asked in surprise when he noticed his friend with the girl. It's a long story, Greg brushed off. Then, turning to Chyla, he said, let's go with me. There are too many curious people around here. Entering the operating area, Greg was surprised to see a patient on the table, covered with a white sheet. Something usually done with deceased individuals, not those awaiting surgery. He told Chyla to stay on the bench where he had seated her, and then he headed to Dermot's office. What a foolish decision that was. Did he really think the child would just sit still? But how could he have known? He had never been involved in raising children before. Upon entering the hospital director's office, he saw that the director was packing his things into a box, and there was a suitcase under the desk that Dermot nudged further away with his foot when he saw Greg, hoping he hadn't noticed. The hospital director was displeased someone had walked in while he was packing, but he agreed to talk to Greg, though he didn't stop his packing. Are you going somewhere? Resigning? Greg asked, completely forgetting what he initially wanted to inquire about. Yes, I'm being transferred to the capital. Imagine that. Such unexpected news, Dermot replied. Very unexpected. And what happened with that businessman? I take it he no longer needs surgery. Greg remembered the reason for his visit. Dermot explained that the patient had died almost immediately after he had called Greg. They simply forgot to call back and tell him not to come to the hospital. He told Greg to go home since there was nothing left for him to do at the hospital today. I hope you're not too upset about having to come in on your day off, the director added. No, everything happened as it should, Greg replied. At that moment, he thought that his meeting Chyla wasn't just coincidence. Even though the businessman could no longer be saved, at least this girl would no longer be working the streets alone. But what the man didn't yet realize was how significant their meeting was going to be for his life. Chyla was a curious girl, unable to stay still. It was her first time in a place like this, and everything around her intrigued her. She examined the operating room with interest, but there wasn't much to see. What intrigued her most was the man lying on the table. Suddenly, his hand slipped out from under the sheet, But Shyla didn't even flinch when it happened. She approached to put his hand back in place. For some reason, she decided that everything should be as it was before Greg left. As she got closer to the table, she noticed a mole on the man's hand, just like hers. She had always thought her birthmark on her wrist resembled a teddy bear. It did indeed resemble the head of a toy bear. Without much thought, Shyla pushed back the sheet to see the man with the same birthmark as hers. When she saw the man's face, she froze. He had a small mole above his lip, just like hers. Shyla carefully examined the man. He had hair the same color as hers, plump lips, and a thin nose. He looked so much like her, despite his face being disfigured with scars. The resemblance between them was undeniable. "Is this my dad?" Shyla said aloud and started to cry. "Shyla, what are you doing?" panicked Greg, who had come looking for her. When he saw her crying, he quickly changed his tone and said, "Are you scared? It's okay. Sometimes people die. You shouldn't have looked at that, don't you see?" The girl asked. "This is my dad. Why is he covered? Is he sleeping?" Greg began comparing the man and the girl. He noted the resemblance between them was indeed striking, but he replied that she shouldn't be certain they were related. There are many people in the world who look alike. Greg pondered how to explain everything to her, knowing this girl, more than anyone else, dreams of finding her parents. And now she had to learn that he had passed away. "Just look, we have the same moles," Shyla said, taking the man's hand. As soon as the girl touched the man's hand, her eyes widened. Shyla immediately jumped back from the hand. Greg didn't understand what caused such fright and asked why she was so scared. The girl struggled to formulate a sentence for a long time. "You said this person died, but his hand is warm, and there's something pulsating there," Shyla replied. Greg was surprised that there could be a pulse. He took the patient's wrist and confirmed that the man lying on the table indeed had a warm hand and a pulse. This was apparently what scared Shyla. The surgeon began to piece together how it happened that a living person was declared dead. They had problems with staff at the hospital, but how could they declare a living person dead? He immediately remembered Dermot's sudden move to the capital and promotion, which was unknown until yesterday. In small towns, news spreads quickly, and their chief was the type of person who shared his successes with everyone. Greg immediately called his friend Bob and asked him to detain Dermot by any means necessary, while he himself called the police, deciding that competent people should deal with what was happening here. The orderlies came to the operating room. They were about to transfer the patient to the morgue, but Greg told them it wasn't necessary for now. "Dermot told us to quickly process this body. They'll cremate him this evening," one of the orderlies said. "As far as I know, Dermot is no longer the chief of our hospital," Greg replied. "So I'm telling you, this patient doesn't need to go to the morgue." The orderlies shrugged and left the operating room. They didn't care whose orders they followed, but if they were told not to work, then they didn't have to and could rest. Greg decided to examine the man. There were visible bruises on his body, indicating he had indeed been in an accident. After the examination, Greg realized that the man still needed surgery. He escorted the girl out into the corridor and called for assistance. In the corridor, he noticed that Bob had barricaded Dermot's office door. His friend immediately approached him and asked, "Can you explain what's going on?" Bob asked, "Are you going to operate on a dead patient? I locked the chief in the office. Can't you hear him yelling at us? I hope you haven't gone mad. The thing is, this patient is alive, but he's in critical condition." Greg replied, "I'm going to operate on him now." And our Dermot decided to urgently leave town. And I saw some suitcase under his desk. I think it's a payoff. Bob clutched his head, finding it hard to believe what he had heard. But no one doubted that their boss could be bribed. He had a deep love for money and never turned down bribes or gifts. But to agree to something like this, you need to tell all this to the police. They are already on their way to the hospital. Greg continued, I'll give my statement after I've operated on the man. And also, you need to look after the girl. Any more instructions?" Bob yelled, slightly offended. Chyla immediately approached Bob and took his hand. The girl looked up at him with a questioning and sad gaze. He had never seen such sad eyes before. He led her to the staff room, gave her a pen and a blank sheet of paper so she could draw, and then went to meet the police. Greg went to prepare for the surgery, feeling anxious. It had been a long time since he had felt such nervousness, but he had never had to treat a patient under such circumstances before. He emerged from the operating room 4 hours later. Greg was barely standing but kept going because he had much more to do. In the hospital, no one understood why the chief was arrested and how Dermot could have made such a diagnostic error. Everyone can make a mistake, but to confuse a living person with a dead one was indeed strange. Colleagues began to gather around Greg, eager to ask for all the details. He brushed them off, saying he didn't know anything. When Greg entered the staff room, he found Chyla asleep on the couch, with Bob dozing off in a chair beside her. As soon as the surgeon entered, Bob immediately woke up. He informed Greg that Dermot had been arrested by the police but was still not talking. Indeed, $1 million had been found in his office, but when asked where it came from, the man claimed he had saved it. Imagine how long he must have been saving. Bob laughed. It's very strange for such a story to unfold in our small town. How did this businessman end up in our hospital, of all places? Greg wondered. He wouldn't have his question answered until the next day. That evening, he took the sleeping Chyla and drove home with her, deciding to figure out what to do with the girl later. The next day, Greg and Chyla went back to the hospital. Bob had been appointed the acting hospital chief since he was previously the department head and had the most achievements among the staff. Greg sincerely congratulated his friend and inquired if there were any news about yesterday's patient. "Yes, he's conscious now," Bob replied. "He's very eager to speak with you, but he's currently talking to the investigator." Greg told his friend about the girl he had brought to the hospital the day before. Bob clutched his head and exclaimed, "What's happening in our town? Can you even imagine what will become of this girl now?" It took another 2 hours before Greg could visit the man whose life he had saved the day before. The businessman introduced himself as Darren. He thanked the surgeon profusely and promised to fulfill any request he might have. "I have another piece of news for you, but first, I would like to understand what exactly happened to you," Greg asked him. Darren began his story by saying that 8 years ago, he was just an ordinary guy who wanted to achieve something in life. He had a girlfriend, but after a quarrel, they decided to break up. "After that breakup, my business started to improve," Darren reminisced. "I feel very guilty towards my beloved woman. We led the wrong lifestyle. Only I managed to come to my senses and change, but unfortunately, she did not. At that time, we were young and drank a lot of alcohol. We went to various parties together. Then I said that I wanted to spend time not in clubs, but at expensive resorts. And I decided to find a decent job. I have a higher education, but at that time, I was working as a loader. We decided to break up when she moved to a small town because she had no money. At that time, I got a job as a manager at a large company. By the way, I'm now on the board of directors of that firm. 2 years later, I found out that my ex-girlfriend had died. Apparently, she had a failed attempt to sober up after a party, and her heart couldn't handle the strain. It's a pity." Of course, Greg listened very attentively to Darren's story. He thought that Chyla could very well be the daughter of his former lover. It turns out that the man might not even know he has a daughter, or he simply hasn't mentioned it. "How did you end up near our small town?" Greg asked, surprised. "I wanted to buy a piece of land nearby," Darren answered. "The prices here are affordable, and it doesn't matter to us where to open a production. But I didn't make it to your small town. I remember exactly how it happened. I was driving on a green light when a logging truck crashed into my car. I don't understand how I survived that accident. Probably, the airbags in the car saved me. Are you aware of why you were declared dead? Greg asked again. It's also a mystery to me. But I suspect that the accident wasn't an accident. I am a businessman, and I have many enemies. Darren replied. Greg decided not to mention the girl to Darren right away, feeling that Darren had enough to process at the moment. After speaking with the man, he planned to go to the police to determine if Chyla was indeed the businessman's daughter. However, when Chyla heard that she was going to be taken to the police station, she became very upset. They'll send me back to the orphanage, the girl said and began to cry. Greg tried to explain that he had no other choice. Then, the girl ran out of the exam room and started opening every door in the hospital, looking for her dad. She was lucky. No one caught her before she found the right room with the businessman. Daddy. She screamed loudly and hugged Darren. The man winced in pain. Even the slightest touch caused him excruciating pain. And here was a girl squeezing his body. Darren pushed Chyla away. But when he saw her face, his expression changed. How is this possible? Darren said, astonished. You're my dad. Look at me. Chyla responded and showed him a birthmark. The man compared his hand to hers, carefully examining the mole. But it wasn't just that which convinced him the girl in front of him was indeed his child. The girl looked very much like him, but she also bore features of her mother. Chyla strongly reminded him of Lisa, his former girlfriend with whom he had broken up 8 years ago, the very person he had been telling the surgeon about. Greg had been standing at the door for a while, observing everything happening in the room. The patient beckoned him over and asked how the girl had ended up there. Greg explained that he found her on his way to the hospital when he was coming to perform surgery on him. Darren asked the doctor to look after Chyla until he recovered and could address the situation himself. He inquired about what had happened to her mother and how she ended up in an orphanage. But the girl replied that she couldn't remember anything. The caregivers don't share such details with the children, especially at such a young age as hers. Greg agreed to take her in until everything could be sorted out. After his shift at the hospital, he and Chyla went home. He managed to leave work a bit early that day because his new boss, who was also Greg's best friend, decided to give him a shortened day, understanding that he needed some rest after the tumultuous last few days. As Chyla and Darren approached the house, the girl noticed Niall. The boy was playing near the doctor's home. How are things with your mom? Everything's fine. After talking to you, she stopped drinking alcohol. Niall replied cheerfully. Chyla asked to play with him because she didn't want to be stuck at home again. After all, she had spent the last few days in the hospital. Greg didn't mind. He asked the kids to be careful outside. The doctor decided to distract himself in his usual way by doing some chores around the house. Unfortunately, he couldn't fix the gate again as it was already getting dark outside. Greg sat on a bench, releasing cigarette smoke. He rarely smoked, but the events of the past few days had worn him out to the point where he had to fetch the pack of cigarettes he'd placed in a drawer a week ago. Greg remembered taking it out the evening his wife told him she was leaving him for another man. His contemplation was interrupted by children's voices. Niall and Chyla were coming, and a few seconds later, they ran into the yard, playing tag. Then, Sandra entered through the gate. She asked the children to play outside the gate because she had something important to discuss with Greg. If you're looking for alcohol, I don't have any, Greg said, with a hint of irony. I wanted to ask about the girl. Where did she come from? Sandra inquired. It doesn't matter, Greg responded, extinguishing his cigarette. Sandra pulled out a photograph from her pocket and showed it to him. Greg looked at the picture, smiled, and asked, are you trying to boast that among your drinking buddies, there are not only men but women too? Maybe stop the sarcasm, Sandra asked, annoyed. Look at this girl. Doesn't she remind you of someone? The photo showed Sandra and another woman hugging each other, with glasses in their hands. Greg didn't immediately understand why she was showing him this picture. but he took the photograph and looked closer. The woman did remind him of someone, but he couldn't figure out who. And who is this exactly? He asked seriously. It's a friend of mine, though she's been dead for a while, Sandra replied. She could have competed with me for the title of the worst mother. Not even a month after her daughter was born, she started drinking heavily. And during her pregnancy, she wasn't against alcohol either. She told me she left her boyfriend and then found out she was pregnant. But she drank so much that she only noticed her pregnancy when her belly had grown. Greg quickly remembered what Darren had told him at the hospital. Their stories were strikingly similar, and that girl was also named Lisa. That's when he realized who the woman in the photograph reminded him of. It was Chyla's mother. Greg asked to keep the photo to show Darren and verify if this might be the same woman the businessman had encountered. Where do you know her from? I don't remember such girls in our small town, Greg asked. She lived in the neighboring town. My husband and I used to go there sometimes, Sandra replied. By the way, I wasn't so heavily dependent on alcohol back then. I've heard you're not drinking anymore. Well done. Greg commended his neighbor. Sandra responded that she wouldn't return to her past and would no longer drink alcohol. While it was difficult for her to resist, she was determined to do everything to provide a better future for her son. She even got a job. The next day, Chyla and Greg went back to the hospital. The girl now wanted to spend more time with her father. The doctor also stopped by Darren's room but didn't manage to talk to him. He ran into his friend, who had now officially become the hospital's chief. Bob was walking down the hallway, easily recognizable from afar by a huge, bloody bruise adorning his face. Who did this to you? Greg asked with a smile. Have you not heard what happened to your patient last night? Bob inquired. That evening, Bob had stayed late at work to deal with hospital paperwork. Now in a significant position, he was intent on improving the hospital's operations. He didn't notice nightfall and decided to stay at the hospital overnight, as it made no sense to go home by then. Around 3 in the morning, he heard some noise. Bob went into the corridor, and the sound repeated. From a distance, there were sounds of blows, followed by a man calling for help. Bob cautiously approached the room from which the strange noises were coming. He almost immediately guessed it was the businessman's room. The door was open, and Bob saw a man standing near the patient's bed. The doctor called the police first, then entered the room. He grabbed the assailant, whom Darren was already holding by the arm, and a struggle ensued between the men. Bob noticed that the unknown individual had a syringe in his hand. Despite doubting his own strength against the stranger, who was totally unprepared for someone to intervene, Bob managed to stop him. The police arrived at the hospital very quickly. An investigator informed them that they suspected the person who had attempted to assassinate the businessman would try to finish the job. How could an outsider just walk into the hospital without any trouble? A police officer asked Bob. You're aware of who our previous hospital chief was, right? Bob replied with a hint of irony. I haven't had the chance to change everything yet. I agree. We practically have no security. I hope your hospital won't have such problems anymore. The officer responded. Darren revealed that he recognized the person who tried to poison him as his main business rival. The investigator suggested that this rival was the one who orchestrated the car accident and then bribed Dermot. In the morning, Darren was woken by a call from the police, informing him that it was indeed his business rival who had arranged the assassination attempt. A fact revealed by the driver who had crashed into Darren's car. So that's the story, Bob concluded. Darren seems to be quite unlucky, Greg replied. On the contrary, I think he's very lucky, Bob countered. He's been targeted for murder twice, and both times they failed to kill him. Greg finally made it to his patient's room that day. Chyla was already sitting there beside her dad, happily recounting their life with Greg. Darren was delighted to see the doctor who saved his life. The surgeon conducted the usual health check, examined the stitches, and reviewed the patient's test results. Then they had a calm conversation. Guess what? The police already figured out what happened to me. Greg cheered up. They found the driver who intentionally crashed into my car. He turned out to be a foolish man who believed the police and told them who paid him to crash into my car. And the most insulting part is, my life was valued at only $3 million. And they even promised that if anything came up, he'd be taken care of in jail. But when they found out the man was still alive, they paid Dermot, the hospital chief, to quickly send Darren to the morgue for cremation. So, did the driver confess to everything? Greg asked in surprise. Yes, and your Dermot gladly provided the name of the person who paid him off to have me killed. Greg replied. He got the same amount of money as the truck driver. So, my life was valued at just $6 million. I heard you had another adventure last night. Greg added. Yes, that man actually showed up at the hospital. Darren confirmed. If it weren't for your new hospital chief, we wouldn't be having this conversation now. Amazing people live in your small town. Very kind and good people. Maybe I should move here too. I understand you've already had enough excitement, but I have a photo of Chyla's mom. Greg said. Take a look. Maybe it's the same Lisa. Darren agreed to look at the picture, but when the surgeon handed him the photo, tears streamed down his cheek. He bit his lip and nodded. Despite how badly their relationship ended, this woman once meant a lot to him. He even cried when he learned of her death. Yes, it's her. The businessman whispered softly. So it's true. But why didn't she tell me she was pregnant? I could have helped raise the child. Has Chyla told you about what she went through in the orphanage? And yet all this time she had a father who could have given her so much more than she could ever imagine. You can do that now, Greg suggested. Let's invite Child Protective Services to the hospital. Let them start processing the paperwork for you to officially become her father. Chyla ran away from the orphanage, and the police are probably already looking for her. If they find her at my place, I'll have trouble. I'm surprised it hasn't happened yet. Darren agreed that it would be the right decision. He called his assistant from the capital to represent his interests in court and track the investigation details. Now, the assistant had an additional task: to arrange for Darren to bring Chyla home. First, they needed to establish paternity. Chyla couldn't believe her luck. When Darren told her he would soon take her home, she jumped for joy, ran around the room in circles, and shouted, "Hooray!" But first, he needed to regain his strength and health. Greg informed him that the businessman would have to stay in the hospital for at least another 6 months. A week later, Darren could be transferred to another hospital, and he left for the capital. The assistant quickly processed all the documents, and Chyla went with her dad. The businessman wanted to take Greg with them. He promised to get him a job at the best hospital in the city. But to his surprise, the surgeon refused. He reiterated that he couldn't leave this town because there were hardly any good specialists there. Too bad. You're a good person. Darren said goodbye. But let me find a way to thank you somehow. You saved my life and found my daughter. I can't ignore that. Greg didn't ask for any rewards for his actions. He said any person would have done the same. Nevertheless, Darren still thanked him. Finally, Greg managed to repair the gates at his house. When he was almost finished, a car pulled up to the yard. The man thought it was Darren, although it seemed unlikely at the moment. But no one else could drive such an expensive car in their small town. It turned out to be Darren's assistant. The man silently got out of the car, placed a suitcase in front of Greg, and drove off. Greg tried to ask what it all meant, what was in the suitcase, but he didn't get an answer. Opening the suitcase, he immediately closed it. There lay a sum of money he had never seen in his life and would never have earned. There was also a note in which Darren thanked the man again for his help, provided the address and phone numbers of Chyla and himself. The businessman asked him to accept this gift and never forget about them and his daughter. He noted that Greg would always be a welcome guest in his home, and also that Chyla already missed him. Thus, Greg found two new friends, a successful businessman from the capital and a little girl who considered him her savior. Greg went back to the yard to smoke, but this time he wanted to relax and think about the good. When he went out of the gate to get the tools, he noticed Sandra playing with Niall in the neighboring yard. He smiled and stopped to watch them. He was so happy for the boy. It seemed his mom had really decided to change her life this time. She hadn't been drinking alcohol for a whole month. That night, he fell asleep feeling peaceful. Just like that, in a few days, he managed to change the fate of several people. But he wasn't proud of it. He just pondered how interesting these people's lives had changed. Calling Darren, he learned that the competitors who orchestrated the businessman's accident had been imprisoned. And thanks to this event, the saved man was even able to increase his income because now there was no longer a company in the market that had been his competitor before. And if Chyla hadn't discovered that the man was alive under the blanket, everything could have turned out differently for them. As soon as Greg fell deeply asleep, he was immediately awakened by a loud knock on the door. He quickly got up from the bed and, looking out the window, noticed that the neighbor's house was on fire. Has Sandra started drinking alcohol again? Greg thought. He concluded that the woman must have been drunk and started the fire in her own home. This had happened several times before, as she often fell asleep with a cigarette in her hand or left the stove on because she used to be in an unstable state. Greg opened the door, only to find a frightened Niall standing there, with a bruise under his eye. "Help! They're hurting my mom." The boy cried hysterically. Greg immediately grabbed a stick from the yard and rushed to help. In the neighboring house, some man was beating poor Sandra, and nobody was helping her because everyone was busy extinguishing the fire. Greg quickly intervened, stopping the angry man who was heavily intoxicated and barely able to stand. But even then, it was difficult for the fragile woman to deal with him. While Greg was rescuing Sandra, a rescue team arrived at the house. The fire was quickly extinguished, but it was already impossible to live in the house. Almost everything had burned down. Sandra lay on the ground crying beside the burnt house. She was badly bruised, but that wasn't her main concern. Sandra realized she was left homeless with her young son. When the neighbors realized there was no more danger, they quickly dispersed to their homes, unwilling to help Sandra, thinking she was to blame for the fire. Only Greg remained by her side. He hugged Niall and comforted him. Greg hesitated to approach Sandra, but when she calmed down a bit, he offered them to stay overnight at his house. "No, I don't need your help," Sandra confidently refused. Apparently, she was so shocked that she hadn't yet realized that Greg genuinely wanted to help her. "You need to treat your wounds. I'm a doctor, or have you forgotten?" Greg reminded her. "And the child needs to get some sleep." The woman agreed to spend the night at the doctor's house. Her face and body were covered in bruises and marks. Niall quickly fell asleep, while Sandra and Greg stayed in the kitchen to talk. "What happened?" Greg asked. "It was all Troy. He came to our house at night and demanded that I drink alcohol with him," Sandra said. "But I told him I don't drink anymore and asked him not to come here again. A few minutes later, I smelled smoke, and then I saw the fire in the house. It appeared in all the rooms at once. We barely managed to get out of the house with Niall. I'm sure Troy set my house on fire. He was heavily drunk and wanted to retaliate against me. Then, he started beating me on the street. It seems he even hit Niall because my son tried to defend me. We won't let him get away with it," Greg said firmly. Greg took the conversation with Sandra very seriously. Firstly, he felt sorry for Niall. And secondly, as Sandra started to change for the better, Greg began to see her differently. He knew how difficult it was to overcome alcohol addiction. Being a doctor himself, Sandra had changed a lot in a short time, but he was confident that she would become a completely different person in the future. But now she didn't even have her own home. The man remembered the money Darren had given him as a token of gratitude for saving his life. The surgeon hadn't spent a single dollar of it. Now he thought that he could use it to help Sandra's family. The money sent by the businessman would be enough for several houses in their small town. But Greg thought Sandra wouldn't agree to such a large and gratuitous gift. So he decided to offer her help a little later. "Stay with me for now," Greg said. Sandra looked at him with surprised eyes. She wasn't used to someone caring about her. Moreover, she didn't expect such help from Greg. After all, he had scolded her many times, and now he was offering a place in his own house. "Don't worry, you won't bother me," the man continued. "I spend a lot of time at work, and I live alone. I don't do much housework in this house, as you can see. And Niall, I've always loved him as my own son. I think he'll be happy with this offer." "You know I don't have a choice," Sandra replied sadly. "I don't think anyone else will offer me help. They only extinguished the fire in my house because they were afraid for their property, which could also burn down. You've brought this reputation upon yourself in our small town. Regaining people's trust will be much harder than losing it," Greg grumbled. Sandra agreed to Greg's offer, as she really had no other options. In gratitude to the man, she took on all the household chores in the house. She cleaned, cooked, and even took care of the garden. 2 months had passed since Sandra and her son had been living with Greg. Troy, who had set fire to her house, was sent to prison. Proving his guilt was not difficult at all. Not a single person in the small town could say a bad word about Sandra anymore. All the local residents noticed that she had changed. Besides becoming quiet and calm, she also transformed externally, becoming neater and more beautiful. Greg interacted with Niall like a father with his son. They went to the forest together, did chores in the yard. The man taught the boy how to ride a bike, swim, and fish. Greg was happy, and Sandra felt safe. One day, Greg realized that he didn't want Sandra to leave this house. The only thing he didn't like was that Sandra didn't feel like the mistress of this house. She still asked for his permission to turn on the TV and clarified where she should sleep. Although from the very first night, the man had told them to sleep with Niall on the big bed, while he himself went to sleep on the couch. But this behavior was easily explained by the fact that Sandra understood that one day she would be told to leave this house. Every day Sandra woke up with this thought and fell asleep thinking that tomorrow would surely be the last day of their peaceful life with her son. "Sandra, let's have an honest talk," Greg said. The woman was a little scared, thinking that this conversation was about them and her son having to move out of this house. Her hands and chin trembled. Sandra modestly sat down at the table, and of course, Greg noticed her agitation. So, he hurried to reassure her. "I don't want you to leave this house," Greg said. "This is your home, and you are my family. I think you won't disagree that we have all become close. Niall will soon start calling me Dad, and you and I still can't admit our feelings to each other." Sandra relaxed a bit, but now she started worrying about another matter. After all, she had long been in love with Greg, but never allowed herself to entertain the thought that they could be together. It was because she considered herself unworthy of such a good and honest man. "Sandra, please don't stay silent," Greg said. "Tell me your answer. If you don't have the same feelings for me, I'll buy you a house wherever you want. I can even buy you an apartment in the city. I have the money." Sandra was even more surprised, as she couldn't understand what she had done to deserve such a kind and honest man. Finally mustering the courage to speak, she agreed. Sandra began by confessing her feelings for Greg, and only then did she add that she also wanted to continue living together with him. Niall was the most overjoyed by this news. In his dreams, he couldn't fathom living in a happy family with his mom and dad. "Thank you, Dad," Niall said. Greg was very pleased to hear such words from the boy. But they still had to move. Living in the small town had become impossible. Despite what the locals said about Greg and Sandra, they started laughing at the man whom they had once respected and began saying that he was living with a bad woman. Greg decided to buy an apartment in the city. This way, he bid farewell to anything that reminded him of his past life, and they started anew, as Sandra could finally stop thinking about her past. Now it was easier for Greg to commute to his new job. Niall started first grade at a good school, and Sandra found work. Greg decided to set aside the money Darren had given him. He planned to spend part of it on his wedding with Sandra and save the rest for Niall's education. The main guests at their wedding were Chyla and Darren. They also shared how good it was for them to live together. After all, Chyla was able to find a family, a dad and a mom. It turned out that Darren had long had a fiancée who gladly began spending time with Chyla, and now their families often visited each other, and Niall and Chyla became best friends.